Hi, welcome back to the next episode of the Keto Naturopath. I'm Dr. Carl Goldkamp. Today we're going to continue what we were working on before, which is how do you make epigenetics work for you? It's such a fancy word. People think that it's going to make them become instantaneously younger, and therefore the most superficial aspect of that sort of thinking is, oh, all my wrinkles will go away. I don't know about that, but there's a profound part of using epigenetics to help your state of health, your health span, and we're going to get into it. But we need to cover a few things first so you get how important this is and that it's something that you can really use for yourself. It's not something that's strictly about you need to go to some academic lab in one Ivy League school. No, this is something that you can start on tomorrow, and we can get into progressive, more sophisticated applications of epigenetics for you personally and how to do that by the end of this video and certainly into the next one. So let's get started. So how can we make epigenetic reverse aging work for you? And when I say reverse aging, I'm not sort of blowing smoke here. This is true. So what do we know so far from what we've covered so far? Chronologic age, the number of birthdays you've had, is not the same number of your epigenetic age, biologic age, as measured by the methylation clock. We referred to that, and we're going to get into much more detail in the next video on that. Okay, also, you can affect your epigenetic age. The studies have shown this to be true. There's 3 studies that have already been done. They're going to be redone as well, the new age, the TRIM, and the vitamin D study. And so they've all used the same clock, and the clock is even becoming much more sophisticated to give us even more information. But just want to say that it has been done. We're going to get into these studies again in another video. It's too big for that here. Okay, the key is to create a healthy methylation pattern. This is a concept I want to have you sort of hold in your hands for a little bit. We've heard, if anybody has been paying attention, about methylation. It's not just about methylation. It could be about unmethylating. We've talked about last time that what we discovered is as you get older, you're losing the ability to control what genes should be methylated, turned off, and what genes should be turned on and demethylated. And you need to have that ability to do both. And losing that discretion, losing that control, really is part of what happens when we go through aging. In essence, as I always say, what happens to make the wheels come off the car? It doesn't happen all at once. It happens partially, and there's signs about maybe you ought to get the wheels checked and other things. Okay. And we are not all the same, so we can all do the same thing and get different results to say, and we're going to go into details about that. Okay. Looking at the latest study that I've been using this as sort of the cornerstone of this series of videos is reversing aging epigenetically using only whole foods and primarily what I consider one supplement, and why it didn't work for everyone in the study, but it did work for many. What's the difference? Here's that study, the potential reversal of epigenetic age using a diet and lifestyle intervention, a pilot randomized clinical trial done last tax day of April 15th of 2021. Okay, these are those results, just to sort of give an overview of the 18 final analysis. 8 scored age reduction, 9 were unchanged, and 1 increased in methylation age. Here we go. Let's start with the bad news. 1 became actually older. So here's how you read this scale here. This beige line in the middle is basically no change. So if this person started the program, 8-week program, and they we're saying about 48 here. This is how we read this, right? It's across this way, down that way. So about 48 at the end of the program, they were 10 years older. I don't think they were too happy, or they just signed up and got paid for being in this study and they walked away. But still, you go, why the heck is that? 9 became unchanged. So the majority were unchanged, and 8 became younger. So they clearly were successful here. And 8 is a pretty significant number. So nearly half of everybody in this group became younger, and some clearly became very young. So here's how we read this. This is probably about 63, and they became 10 years younger. They became 10 years younger. That was a coup. And there's a number of those that kind of parallel the same line. Okay, so why is the difference? So in order to use these results to increase your own health span, we've talked about health span before, we must understand a brief history of epigenetics. Let's put it into a larger context so you really understand how remarkable this is. This isn't a one-off sort of little trick that you can do, take this vitamin, take this supplement. It's a little bigger context. It can be possibly as simple as that, though I'd prefer it not to be that way. It's a little more holistic, it certainly can be. And this study that we looked at was basically a holistic, whole food oriented way of changing and creating a healthier methylation pattern. Okay, so what we need to look at are how to see these effects, that these effects are actually transgenerational. They go on to the next generation from us. And we'll see this other examples as well. To know what is required to create an optimal methylation process. An optimal methylation process, which is the genes that should be turned off are turned off, and you have the control, you have the ability to keep those turned off, methylated. And then you need obviously genes that need to be turned on, your eyeball genes in your eyeball, but off in your toe, etc., etc. So you need to have that discretion and that control at keeping that discretion at all times. How to get tested and why you would want to do that, and why this actually is probably the most important testing that I think we'll ever do. The road to now, epigenetically, was not a straight road. Absolutely fascinating. So here's the epigenetic timeline as I put it together. Somebody else could put one of theirs together, but this covers the big spaces, and I think, and we're going to look today, through the lens of how we developed these little pieces, and each one was really important to opening up the next set of questions. So you have 1944-45, the Dutch hunger winter. Then you have the siege of Stalingrad. So both of those have to do with World War II. Then you have the Calyx study, 2001. Then you have at Duke University, Randy Geertels working with agouti mouse and amazing things he did. That was 2003, 2007. You have Dr. Steve Horvath's clock, they call it a DNA methylation aging clock, able to determine epigenetic age, 2013. Then you have the three studies that I showed you, 2019 to 2021, and now we have personalized testing. This has now come into the mainstream as in just barely a couple months ago, just getting liftoff here. Let's get some details. So the Dutch hunger winter, 1944-45, was a period of about roughly 10 months. And it's unique in all of humanity in terms of hellaciously terrible starvation periods to measure. Most time when people starve, they starve because of famine. You know, the global warming, however you want to look at it, that it basically, they couldn't get the food and water, and a population at large began to die gradually. But this was not that way. This is at the end of World War II, in which was a complete blockade by the Germans and a very harsh winter that froze up all the ports so nothing could be brought into them. So for about 10 months, this is basically the blockade in Holland, in the Netherlands, from 44 to 45. So what happened? This is from 2018, New York Times. It says the famine ended 70 years ago, but Dutch genes still bear scars. Absolutely. It's worth going through some of this here. So in September 1944, trains in the Netherlands ground to a halt. The Dutch railroad workers were hoping that a strike could stop the transport of Nazi troops, helping to advance the Allied forces. But the Allied campaign and the Nazis punished the Netherlands by blocking food supplies, plunging much of the country into famine. By the time the Netherlands was liberated in 1945, more than 20,000 people had died of starvation. So they call this the Dutch hunger winter. But it's been because the society was very literate, because the society was a working society, people went to their appointments, they went to doctors and so on and so forth. The documentation of every day of that famine, that artificially induced, if you will, famine, was documented. So all the different labs were studied, the diagnosis were documented, and what has happened is that they've studied how famine affects adults, how famine affects children, how famine affects the children that were in utero that were still in their pregnant mother's womb for that time, and the different parts. So was their mother just pregnant towards the end of the 10 months, and so she had been starving and then conceived? Were they conceived at the beginning? Absolutely fascinating. And then from there, that's not just the story, actually. That's the minor part of the story, believe it or not. It's what happened to the subsequent generation of those kids that experienced that starvation, and what happened to the grandkids. So now they're on the 4th generation, and they have a report that people go back and you now can look up genetically the blood samples and so on and so forth. It's become an amazing laboratory, if you will. So pregnant women, it turns out, were uniquely vulnerable, and the children they gave birth to have been influenced by famine throughout their lives. When they became adults, the kids that were in utero at the time, when they became adults, they ended up a few pounds heavier than the average. In middle age, they had higher levels of triglycerides and LDL. They also experienced higher rates of such conditions such as obesity, diabetes, and schizophrenia. And by the way, this is reproduced kind of like famine-wide. Pick your famine, you'll see at the end, schizophrenia is almost a universal aspect of what happens of those who survive as a kid, but we're talking about adult life. So they had the schizophrenia in adult life, not as a child. By the time they reached old age, those risks had taken a measurable toll, according to the research. And they reviewed all the records of hundreds of thousands of Dutch people born in the mid-40s. They found that people who had been in utero during the famine, known as the Dutch winter cohort, died at a higher rate than people born before or after. We found 10% of the increase in mortality after 68 years. The patterns that Dr. Lumi, who did all this work, and his colleagues documented are not disrupted. But scientists still are struggling to understand how they came about. So the data is not in question. It wasn't the interpretation. It was sound. It's like, but what's the mechanism? How did this happen? Okay, for those who want to go deeper, I went deeper on a podcast. Here's the podcast, Dutch Famine Led to Obesity and Schizophrenia in Following Generations. Feel free, and there's the link for that. There's only so much you can do on a video and so much you can do in a podcast. So how on earth can your body remember the environment it was exposed to in the womb and remember that decades later is basically the question. Okay, so their study suggests that the Dutch hunger winter, silenced certain genes. Remember silencing, methylation, demethylation. Silenced certain genes in unborn children that they stayed quiet for their whole life. So certain genes were permanently turned off. Well, all cells in a person's body share the same genes. Different genes are active or silent in different cells and at different times. That program largely is locked in place before birth. But scientists have learned that later experiences, say exposure to a virus, can cause cells to quiet a gene or boost its activity, i.e. methylate or unmethylate a gene, sometimes permanently. The study of this long-term gene control is called epigenetics. Okay then, researchers have identified molecules in the cells used to program DNA, but how those tools work isn't exactly clear. One of the best studied is a molecular group called methyl group. So you get into methylation. Many researchers have speculated that prenatal conditions can influence a person's health across their lifetime, and some have speculated that methyl groups, or other forms of epigenetics, put this so-called fetal programming into action, turning things on or turning things off. Okay, DNA methylation these are current studies. So this is 2018, still looking at that set of data. It's still it's generation after generation after generation. Now they're in their 4th generation from those who were born in the 40s. So the DNA methylation is a predictor of the association between prenatal adversity and risk factors for the metabolic disease in adulthood. Our data are consistent with the hypothesis that epigenetic mechanisms mediate the influence of transient adverse environmental factors. So it's epigenetic factors deal with the environmental factors, be them good or bad, in early life on long-term metabolic health. So that's why you see generation after generation of people who do have metabolic problems, be it obesity, diabetes, type 1, type 2. But when you look at a family, they eat together and they share similar habits. So it's just by looking, you can't deduce that. Genetically, it reveals a similar conclusion, though. So what was learned? Millions starved during the hunger winter. Children of pregnant women exposed to the famine were more susceptible to diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular, microalbuminuria, which is low albumin in your serum, and other health problems. The children were smaller, as expected. When these children grew up and had children, those children were smaller than average. This data suggested that the famine experienced by the mothers caused some kind of epigenetic changes that were passed down to the next generation. This point is now being argued that they're not quite sure if it was passed down or not, but up until a couple of years ago, it was pretty much set in stone that it was transgenerational. Adults who were in utero during the Dutch famine had a doubling and tripling of the incidence of schizophrenia. So all those in utero kids, from the beginning of the famine to the end of the famine, and there's a slight differentiation, were prone to huge, much higher schizophrenia rates. So think of neurotransmitters of the brain, at the very least. Concepts, the thrifty gene, the Barker hypothesis, and the fetal origins of adult disease came out of this specifically. Okay, let me show you something here. The epigenetic control of gene expression. This comes from, notice in the bottom, this comes from what I'm saying, this cache of data that they go back to. So it's now called the Dutch Famine Human Epidemiological Studies and the Development of Origin of Adult Health and Disease. This is on and on and on. So what you have the mother's environment, right? So during the time of starvation, the mother is obviously affected. The father is obviously affected. So putting the mother and father together, they have their, depending how much exposure they had for the famine. But then you had the fetuses we just read about that were pregnant during the time of the famine. But then you had the kids, the children that they had. So the first generation that was affected were those who were in utero. Second were the sons and daughters of, and then the grandsons and daughters of. So you have 3 generations that were affected by the famine. So the human epidemiological studies on the diet, Dutch famine, Dutch hunger winter 1944-45, Germans blockade of food supplies in Western Netherlands, followed by harsh winter meant access was cut. It was 1,000 calories dwindling down to 580 calories per adult per day, and that's roughly 400 calories of bread and 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds of potatoes per week as an entire adult ration. As an entire adult ration. By the way, 400 grams of bread is not even a loaf of bread. So that's what they ate. So forget about nutrients. It was basically eking by on calories only. Okay, a window into the present context for many countries. For many, I'm bringing this right up to the present now, right? Giving you a boom. Now we're talking 2021. For many, it is an obesogenic diet that we're offered by all the processed foods. So now you're looking at a mother who has an obesogenic diet. She's not starving. She has food devoid of nutrition but high in calories. Not nutrient dense at all. So same diagram. The mother's affected, the father's affected, the fetus that she's carrying is affected, the children thereof. So we're affecting 3 generations by poor nutrition. Starvation by processed food, calorie-rich, nutrient-poor. The siege of Leningrad that I mentioned before in the timeline, 900 days, 1.5 million civilians lost. Civilians, we're not talking about warfare and so on and so forth. The primary difference between the Dutch hunger winter and the siege of Leningrad was, 1, the length of time, roughly. The Dutch hunger winter was about 300 days versus 900 days for the siege of Leningrad. What they call inappropriate adaptation. What happened here? One of the predictions made by, this is called adult origin of health diseases, is fetal adaptation to scarcity. So for all those in utero, boys and girls, that they were adapting to an environment of scarcity. So they are going to be thrifty. They're going to be very good at storing things because later when it gets even tougher, they'll have some sort of energy. They won't die. They'll be able to reach into their reserves. So they adapted to be a storage first. Okay. So their adaptation to scarcity became maladaptive only when affected individuals are later exposed to an environment of plenty. So the Dutch hunger winter was, at the end of it, there was food. It was more than just calories. They could return to a normal consumption of moderately healthy food. They got healthier, but immediately it was accessible to everybody. It was off like a switch, complete change. So consequently, they now had plenty, but they were adapted to being born in utero. They were adapted to an environment of scarcity. So what happened? In both cases, pregnant women were exposed to severe famine. However, whereas the Netherlands returned to a complete diet quite quickly after the time of severe restriction, there were continuing shortages in the USSR. So they were basically continued this starvation. They didn't have the worry about the troops coming in and death by being shot and so on, but there just wasn't food and it just wasn't coming to them. There weren't, nobody was dropping by planes of food. They continued starving and gradually found some food for those who made it. Okay, there were continuing shortages in the USSR where those exposed to famine in utero did not exhibit higher rates of either obesity and cardiovascular disease as adults. So in the siege of Stalingrad, those who were born in utero, they didn't become obese. They didn't have cardiovascular issues as an adult because they gradually, we're talking about over years, maybe got back to a normal diet. And because they were adapted to be thrifty, to be storers, reserves, they did very well. I won't say very well, but they didn't get obesity, diabetes type 1 or 2, and or cardiovascular issues. And that's from the Dutch Hunger Winter and the Development of Origins of Health and Disease. And that was 2010, so this is still new information. So now we're on to the Calyx study. Entirely different. I did a podcast on this. Feel free to look it up. It's called The Famine Secret of the Calyx, Sweden. All right, so Calyx study could be one of the most important studies ever done to show that some of the changes passed down to the next generation have little to do with one's parental DNA. Those changes are more about the stresses that one's parents and grandparents, including the grandfathers and great-grandfathers of fathers, experienced pre-puberty. So we're talking about a men's line and what was experienced pre-puberty. The study changed everything in terms of how scientific world looked at genetic inheritance. One man spent most of his adult life documenting it, yet his initial work was deemed not credible. Today we share the story of what happened. The man is Dr. Lars Olav Bigerton, and I've communicated with him to the point that he says, Oli, so I can call him Oli, incredible. He spent 20 years, we'll get into the story. So what Dr. Bigerton found, adolescents who grew up during famine, so he started from the present and went backwards. Adolescents who grew up during the famines tended to have children and grandchildren who lived markedly longer lives, sometimes as much as 30 years. So if they grew up in a famine, wait a minute, we just talked about a famine and they didn't do so well. But here he's saying, looking back, this is a highly documented society. So this is actually into what could be called Lapland, very northern Sweden. But Sweden and Scandinavia are very documented. Things get documented. It's primarily by the church after generation and generation, and not just births and deaths, but harvests and so on and so forth, and celebrations. Sometimes there's as much as a 30-year difference of if your great-grandparent lived through a famine, or did he live through the time of surplus. The descendants of those who grew up during bountiful harvest, a surplus, lived significantly shorter lives. Bountiful harvest lived shorter lives due to higher rates of cardiovascular disease, obesity, and diabetes. The study suggests that epidemiological changes can be altered by environmental factors. Kind of the same lesson, but a whole different situation. He had to track people down that came from this particular part of Sweden, which happens to be an area which he grew up. But he went down far many generations before him and found relatives and documentation of how long did these kids live, and checked the documentations out, and even found current surviving ancestors of those people. So we conclude this is the first demonstration of human transgenerational inheritance of epigenetic marks following ancestral childhood exposure to variability of food availability. Either there was a lot or there was none. A lot or there is none. So he found lifespan, certainly healthspan, lifespan changed dramatically. Variable food availability inducing early developmental origins of adult diseases. What Dr. Bigerton found, his data was never questioned, but his conclusions was considered too radical for any medical publication and was turned down for nearly 20 years. The idea that genetic traits could be created in one generation and could be transgenerational, passed on to the next generation, was beyond foolish. It was considered professionally irresponsible. His work was finally published in a minor journal in 2001, and happened to be a Dutch journal, and became the definitive turning point in understanding epigenetics. In other words, he just turned it completely around because nobody questioned his data. They went back and it was data sound, it's data sound. A fascinating story. So I reached out to him and I started to ask him some questions. I want to give you an orientation of where is over Calyx. Over Calyx is right here. This is the Finnish border between Sweden, that's Norway. Here's Finland over here. So what you have is what they call the Gulf of Bothnia and the Baltic Sea. And I'm giving you this because of the questions I'm asking Ole, like the Bigerton. And these are 4 rivers lead into the Gulf of Bothnia. And so in doing some research, the largest salmon in the world happen to be Atlantic salmon in the world come from the Gulf of Bothnia and the Baltic Sea. So they call them Baltic salmon. And it's the best salmon fishing in the world, as you will see. So my question to him was, so what do we know about over Calyx? And the question I asked Ole that was never asked him before. There's another way of where is over Calyx? There's over Calyx. This is the river Calyx coming down. There's over Calyx. There's Calyx. It's one of the rivers. Here's another picture of it. Here's a picture of the salmon. Oh my gosh, it turns out after some research that the 4 rivers that lead into the Gulf of Bothnia are the best salmon fishing in the world, as of to date, and probably always have been, as determined by size and abundance. Historically, the salmon were so abundant in that area, they put a tax on the amount of fish you caught back as far as the 1600s. So today, the Calyx River is considered one of the best salmon fishing areas in the world. We're talking seriously big salmon, by the way. Seriously big. Okay, so my question to Dr. Bigerton was, when I told him, I said, when I read about the over Calyx study of Sweden, I was curious to know about their general diet of those times. What was it like in the good years? What was it like in the bad years? And I said, besides caloric differences between feast and famine years, I would love to know what their diets were consisting of primarily. And what I was getting at is that maybe their famine years, so none of this changes the data, by the way, that maybe their famine years was really a ketogenic diet, that they had to drop the carbs because all the crops failed, but clearly they must have known living on a river that you could do some fish. So maybe they were hypocaloric, but so my question was, in essence, were the famine years mostly salmon, that they live on mostly salmon, therefore a high protein ketogenic diet? So Ole's answer was this. He said, your mail awakes thoughts of mine that have not been backed. So he's Swedish, by the way. And he works at the Karolinska Institute, which in my view is probably the most progressive medical research institute in the world. And I really enjoy the studies and the work that comes out of that. I just want to go back for a second. I forgot to mention, so that's where I went to. Part of my undergrad was University of Bergen and the University of Oslo. So I'm a little bit familiar with that area and I appreciate that. Okay, so he was saying, the nutrition of the 1800s is not so well studied. And he explained, for the most part, they had potatoes, porridges, much milk and fat. So there's that. Meat, little sugar, no greens such as salad. And he goes to saying, this is kind of what my understanding was. He said there was even such a thing as called bark bread that was made during the very lean years. But we went back and forth on this idea, and I really appreciated his perspective. He said, I can't say yes or no because the fish weren't documented. Interesting. So here we are. Let's look this in another perspective. It says parental, again, 2018. Here's now roughly 20 years later after his original study by Oli. It said parental grandparent exposure to crop failure, or surfeit, surplus, during a childhood slow growth period, pre-puberty, and epigenetic marks on grandchildren's growth, glucoregulatory, and stress genes in 2018. So now we're getting a little more granular. We're getting not so much down to the big numbers. Now he's actually looking at the genes. Very impressive. Failed versus bountiful crops differentially influenced methylation in grandchildren of fathers, paternal grandparents exposed to feast or famine. This is him writing. Is it during the slow growth period, pre-puberty, a sensitive period preceding pre-pubertal growth spurt? So I say, note to me to explain how this affects boys and girls differently. So here we go. You have mom and dad, they have a child. Well, a girl is born with all the eggs she's ever going to have. They're already there at birth. They're obviously not matured. So then when she starts menstruating, you have a release of one egg after the other, and that's where the maturity happens. But they're already developed, they're just not used. Whereas boys don't have any gametes, don't have any germ cells, don't have any sperm production until after puberty. So there's that 9 to 11 years, depending on what the cultural norm is for the puberty for the boys there, that they have experience of, that's where they're imprinted upon the environmental factors, the starving or the excess. So it was that period he's talking about in boys. And so by the time they start producing their germ cells, their sperm, what they experienced in those first 9 years is really what determines that. As opposed to girls, it's what they experienced in utero. And there's the study, 2019. Feel free to look into it. Very fascinating. All right, next up, what we're going to look up next time, we're going to go for the rest of the story of epigenetics and its relevance to how you can use it personally, how to increase your health span with epigenetics, and the opportunity in front of us, epigenetic self-testing and why you would consider it. Till then.